Okay. Okay, hello everybody. Good evening. I hope everybody can hear.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna start recording. Okay. And if Kyungwin, if you could, help me admit, whoever, show up, that would be great. Okay.
I will be happy to do.
Okay, great. All right, let's start. Okay. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our Zoom talk tonight. My name is Ayako Mizumura. I am Academic Director of Center for East Asian Studies at University of Kansas. Tonight's presentation, Dying with the Buddha, by Dr. Sujung Kim, is part of our Global Asia Speaker Series, co-hosted by Center for East Asian Studies and East Asian Languages and Culture at the University of Kansas. This is our kickoff event of this year, and we are honored for the opportunity of having Dr. Kim as a guest speaker. After her talk, we will have a Q&A, but we encourage you to send us your questions using a chat box even during the talk. I'm going to introduce the moderator, Dr. Kyung-Win Yoon, and she will take over afterwards. Dr. Yoon is Associate Professor in the Department of East Asian Language and Culture at the University of Kansas. She's an award-winning teacher and advisor. She has been developing the university's Korean Studies program since 2007. Thanks to Dr. Yoon, KU's Korean Studies program is very successful. She has published numerous journal articles. She's also the author of Shaman's Wages, Trading in Ritual on Chuju Island, published by the University of Washington Press. She's currently working on her second book project on Temple Stay, a short-term retreat program held for laypersons at the Buddhist monasteries. Her recent paper, Engaged Buddhism in Mountain Monasteries, Temple Stay as Wellness Tourism in South Korea, will be published in East Asian Ethnography this coming fall. As a Keeler intra-university professor, she's developing an online course, Happiness in East Asia, which will be offered this fall. She's a great scholar and wonderful person. Please welcome Dr. Kyung-Win Yoon.
Thank you. You are so kind. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I see some of my students joining. I'm so delighted to see you and also to introduce Dr. Sujung Kim, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana. Dr. Kim specializes in both Japanese and Korean Buddhism. It is hard to specialize in one, right? But she does both. Her first book, Shinra, Ryujin, and Buddhist Network of the East Asian Mediterranean, was published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2019. She's currently working on her second book project, tentatively titled Korean Magical Medicine, Buddhist Healing Talismans in Chosŏn, Korea. Talismans are still pretty popular in Korea, and I'm sure in other parts of the world. In fact, I have one myself. Let me share it with you. Made by a Korean shaman who grew up in a Buddhist temple when she was young. I downloaded it from the internet free of charge. I survived very well last year, perhaps thanks to this. Sorry for the diversion. Let's go back to Dr. Kim. Dr. Kim's second book project investigates the religious, historical, and iconographic dimensions of healing, talismans produced in Buddhist settings during the Chosŏn period, 1392 to 1910. This book project is supported by ACLS Robert Ho Family Foundation. We are so fortunate to hear part of her research tonight. The title is Dying with the Buddha, the 24 Buddhist Talismans in Chosŏn, Korea. Let's welcome Dr. Sujung Kim.
Thank you, Kyo, for your wonderful introduction. Everyone can hear me well? And also, thank you so much for the invitation. Our Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Kansas. I'm very honored because I just learned that this is a kickoff event, and I'll be very, very eternally grateful for me to be the first person to go. So, and also I thank you so much for Ayako and everyone else, Gracia, for making this happen, and everyone who, wherever you are, thank you so much for joining us, joining me and joining us tonight. Or yeah, I'm tonight here, but anyhow, let me begin. Let me start with this question. I know death. When you encounter this word, I don't know, a lot of people react differently, a lot of emotions, or, it's something that we cannot really understand that well, right? A lot of people have some strong response, but some people may think it can be a very curious thing to think about, right? Thought exercise. And this image, I thought it's interesting to start with because I don't know whether you have seen this movie, 2022. It's, I think, on Netflix too, because I recently saw it. This actor, his name is Adam Driver. He is driving a car, but this car is not on the road. It's actually floating in the river, and they are about to falling from the fall. So it's kind of capturing the, aesthetic and then the intellectual and the conceptual sort of dilemma or paradox, or a lot of tangled emotions that we all experience when we think about death. So death is such a mystery, and to manage death, people in the past, we developed some coping mechanism, a way to deal with death. So of course, somebody, imagine someone dies, then there will be a funeral. Speaking of funeral, by the way, in this talk, I prepared a couple of images. So there is a warning. I don't necessarily, if you don't necessarily, recognize unless I tell you what it is, but there is one image of mummy. So if you don't want to see it, I will give you a warning before that slide, so you know that is what's coming. So let me go back to the funeral. Funeral is something very interesting. What we call in religion, it is a death ritual, right? So why we need a ritual? Have you thought of that? Ritual is something that, transports you. What is interesting about ritual is scholars in sociology and anthropology for a long time, they try to theorize what rituals do. And a scholar, very well known, Arnold van Gennep, once he theorized rituals has sort of three-part structure. So it starts with separation. So any ritual, rites of passage, that's what he calls it, has this three-part structure that, to complete. So first start with separation. And then you go into liminality, liminal status, kind of limbo, neither nor status. And then you can come back to where you left. and we call it reintegration or incorporation. So this is sort of more conceptual way to think about what ritual takes you, why people perform rituals such as funeral. Basically, what funeral ritual does is it's basically designed to go through a cycle of ordinary life to extraordinary loss and back again to the realm of mundane. So by going through these passages or steps, you can mourn, you can accept that loss, and then eventually come back to your life. But the part that you departed and the part you come back is now a little different. So this is sort of what funeral does. And let's think about funeral in different religions. A lot of religions kind of organize around these funerals. And in Buddhism, funeral has been, in the case of Japanese Buddhism, for instance, in East Asian Buddhism, has been studied by a number of scholars. But when it comes to Chosŏn, Chosŏn is one dynastic period in Korean history, which starts from 14th century, lasted until early 20th century. So during the Chosŏn period, Buddhism was quite active, but in the conventional or previous scholarship, the common narrative has been like this. Joseon was Neo-Confucian state, therefore, Neo-Confucianism didn't get along with other religious ideologies such as Buddhism, Taoism, Gyoim's specialty shamanism. All these things were marginalized, so that Buddhism was suffered and Buddhism didn't really do anything. I'm presenting very simplistic narrative, but still that it has been the main narrative, both in the public and the scholarship. But in this talk, this is my, the yellow part is basically the conclusion. So conclusion first. In this talk, I'd like to show you with the examples of talismans actively used in Joseon era, often funeral context. I'm going to argue that talisman was one of the major prominent material aid that really helped Joseon devotionalism, and Joseon Buddhism was much more dynamic and active than one might have imagined. So this is my point. As Gyoim just mentioned, currently I'm working on a book project called Korean Magical Medicine. In this book, I look at the significance of healing talismans. So there are so many different types of talismans we can unpack later if we have more time during the Q&A. But in this book, I want to show the non-elites. Often scholars in religions tend to be more interested in studying elite texts and often male intellectual thoughts. And I think it's also equally important to rescue and recover the unelite and less privileged people's voice. And talisman, which was used pretty much everywhere, but I think crisis like personal crisis like sickness or even death, healing talisman was most significant sort of factor to show how non-elites engage with Buddhist practices on the ground. So this is the premises of my book project. This is the outline. So I'm going to start with definition of it, what is talisman, and then I'm going to give you some brief historical backgrounds. After that, we're going to look at some ritual use of various examples. And then I will also talk about a little bit bigger or underlying issue, which is how talisman works. And then I will end with sort of rethinking my final thoughts on Chosŏn Buddhism. So let me start with the first. Now you are looking at Joseon period. So let's imagine that we took the time machine and we go back to the Chosŏn, let's say mid-Chosŏn, 15th, 16th century. And the room that you are looking at is very typical men's study, actually. And you see a lot of objects like clothes and folding screens and some furniture here. And what I like to show you is talismans in Chosŏn period had so many functions and usages in everyday space. So as you see here, this is one example of folding screen that is basically covered with all sorts of talismans, often bringing good luck. Here you have very likely, if you have a jacket, right, or some daily clothing, very likely if you see here, as you see here, there's a little pouch, and you have little, if you see very closely, there's little paper sticking out. That is the very typical form of talisman, paper talisman, yellow paper, and then often drawn, something is drawn, often illegible, meaning you cannot really tell what it is, but looks like Chinese characters. So that's the talisman here. This is another sort of, imagine that we are entering this room, right? So there is a door, and above the door, there's threshold. That's often you would find talismans. That happened all until 1960s and 70s in Korea, wherever you went. Often you would see some talismans in the living space. And this particular one is called Three Calamities Talisman, which was very, very popular from the medieval China, but also eventually when it made to Korea, it became really, really popular throughout Joseon period. And this is small furniture called soban, and on the surface, what you see is talismans is engraved. So my point here is people were surrounded by talismans. When you were in Chosŏn, somebody's room, that is what you would expect to see. Now, this is, so we have a lot of archaeological evidence to think about what about when you die, right? Joseon people die, what happens? And even though Joseon was Neo-Confucian state, and Neo-Confucianism by default, they wanted to preserve your body. So often cremation was not really recommended, but more sort of burying like this in the coffin was more encouraged. But in it, surprisingly, we find Buddhist talismans, but also along with other sort of, now you see, this is Buddhist talisman that I was mentioning. Sorry for the Koreans, those of you who cannot read, this is basically same talismans here and here. And here are written. So basically, this is the unfolded dimension of the coffin. So this is north, south. Very likely, when you die, people put your head here facing to the north. So imagine that there is a corpse, and then there are some other auspicious animals corresponding to the Chinese ancient ideas. And here is also interesting. We just looked at it. Three calamities talisman was also stamped here. So this tomb is basically from the 15th century, tomb of this Confucian official whose name was Cheongdam. And this is close shot of that talisman that you see here. This is reversed, but if you see here, this is basically diagrams, but this is talismans that I like to unpack more as we go. So let me start with definition of it. Actually, it's as just any other concepts and ideas. Definition is always very difficult. We will have more time, hopefully, in the Q&A, but let me give you a very brief one. So when I say talisman, it is basically a translation of this premodern term, such as pu in Chinese fu or pu-in. Pu-in is another premodern usage that we find, and sometimes just in. But if you are familiar with the Korean culture, or if you are Koreans nowadays, they probably use this word more, 부적. And this second character kind of makes interesting because this is basically a document or a paper. So this is, when I say talisman, this is also corresponding to the term, this term 부적. But 부적 itself is a coined term. It was made in the 1970s for a scholarly use. But I define talisman as broadly as possible. So I define any tangible objects believed to hold magical properties and powers. In my book, for instance, there are so many. So when you think about this definition, a lot of things go into that, right? Even like amulets. What I mean by amulet is like, I often try to distinguish between the two-dimensional, like paper talismans, or some ornaments, or like earrings and jewelries. All these things actually has ancient usage as amulets or a talisman. So those three-dimensional objects, I am not interested in my talisman work. So that's kind of one sort of thing that you want to keep in mind. So what I'm saying when I say talismans, I'm often using it as a translation of this paper talismans. And let me briefly also talk about how talismans work. So in Korean, we have this term, or basically the Chinese term that we use in Korean, but 벽사, which is basically it's a two-directional. One is more inward and the other is outward. So basically you want to protect yourself from the attack from the outside, the demons and evil spirits. People already in the ancient time period, they understood sickness or some malicious things when they happen, that they perceive that to be an attack from outside. So you wanted to protect yourself from that. So that's one how talisman was devised. The other is you want to bring in good luck, good positive influences to sort of secure what you have. So that is called 길상 in Korean. And so we have this one inward, the other outward, sort of two ways functions are expected here. And if you go to YouTube, actually, when you have this question, how to make talismans, I've seen tons of videos how to make talismans, like DIY, right? On YouTube, you can learn anything these days, and including talismans. But it seems talismans are a little bit different from crafting something, right? Because you are basically, the whole idea of talisman is that you are asking some groups of divinities or deities to basically do something that you want them to do. So what that means is that traditionally it was very elaborated when it comes to religious ritual. So making talisman has been highly ritualized, and it is not just for any people, but it's more highly trained person can do that. And you also have to pick a auspicious time, and there are so many, complicated procedures. But that's one thing. But also at some point, not every talisman can be purchased or obtained that way. Therefore, as Koryō just showed, you can download it or you can buy ready-made ones. And it seems, as I'm going to tell you later, spoiler, it seems even in Chosŏn period, there were some ready-made talismans, it seemed. So basically, how to make talismans, you needed a lot of materials, basically to sacralize it. So for instance, ink. Ink is very important. Often the vermilion or red was seen as, it has a lot of symbolic meanings. Often the red color was perceived to be a color that demons, evil spirits do not like, because of its very young energy. So cinnabar or sometimes even blood were used, but also other materials like rarely, but like gold, or to increase healing efficacy. Some people even use herbal decoctions too. And when you think about the paper, because I'm interested in just paper talismans, paper is also very complicated to make, but often they preferred yellow strip or white paper. But for yellow, you have to dye from the white paper. And for that, people use, at least in Korea, they use Chinese scholar tree. And I did some more research on that. And it turned out that that particular tree also, the decoction also, which dye the color to yellow, happen to have medical properties too. So it's kind of very interesting, because in the pre-modern time period, often healing talismans were actually burnt, incinerated, and then the ashes were basically put into a water and then drink it. That completes entire sort of ritual. So you kind of understand why consuming talisman was also a big part of the ritual. It was not just doing something weird, but they kind of, from their firsthand experiences, they knew that they could also hit certain buttons. So, and that's kind of making part, but also there are other sort of ways to make it even more powerful. So visualization, chanting, and breathing, all these things to maximize celestial impact in the talismans. And a lot of ritual manuals also tell you not only making talisman itself is important, but also you have to chant. You have to sort of vocally invoke. We call it dharani. Dharani is incantations, and that is often combined. And in certain cases, hand gestures called mudra were also suggested or encouraged to make the whole thing more powerful. Now, let me move on to the historical transmission. Because there are so many talismans, but in this talk, I'm more focusing on this 24 set. So the particular history of that 24 set seems to be happened later, but to make 24, each individual talisman, either a group of talismans or individual ones, were introduced and circulated in Korean Peninsula roughly from since the Koryō period. But once it was combined as 24, I believe it happened sometime in the late Joseon period. It became one big giant talisman, and this is what I think is it communicates a complex vision and comprehensive benefits, because it collects everything, not everything, but let me repeat. It collects all the popular ones, the most popular ones used in Buddhist ritual contexts. So therefore, that is the most powerful, the complete version, which I'm going to explain more. But before to get to the point, 24, we have different examples, smaller numbers from the Koryō period, right? So often in the Koryō period, elite Buddhist devotional items are left. So something like this, gilt bronze straw box. We have this accordion, very small. If you look at the dimensions, very small, about this size, finger, a little bit over than finger to fingers. But basically, at the end of this particular Dharani text, we have these talismans attached to it, and even little simple Dharani incantation is also written in Indic language. The number gets bigger as we go, but not always we follow the trend. Sometimes we see something like this, 14 talismans at the end of this particular text, which was found inside of Buddhist statues called Bokjang. which in Korean means enshrinement of sacred objects. So if you see the X-rayed image here, right, a lot of stuff are found, thankfully, because Joseon period, the studying Joseon Buddhism has a lot of challenges. One challenge that I mentioned is there's this big narrative, deep-seated narrative that Buddhism suffered. That's one challenge. But the other challenge is there's so little left, or compared to the previous period, Korea, or compared to China or Japan of that same time period, we have very little written or artifacts. But thanks to this, some Buddhist monastics who decided to deposit sacred objects inside of these statues, we have a lot of newly emerging evidence and examples. So this is one Buddhist talisman is one of those objects benefits from this very esoteric practice. Now I'm jumping because we don't have much time, but hopefully I give you some ideas what 24 talisman look like, and there we are. We have 24 talismans here. This particular one is a little bit late, 19th centuries, but I'm going to explain what these are. So what the general pattern is, you have the title or what is for. And then we have this seal-like, stamp-like talismans. So I translate them for you. So the first one was avoiding heat. So you think about, wait, this is Buddhist talisman, avoiding heat, why is so important? But there are a lot of indications that this was not really for Buddhists. Something like promotion in career, that's sort of Buddhist, don't you think? Or concord of couple and longevity, why they care about a couple's love, right? But there's also one talisman, like hitting the jackpot. That's very un-Buddhist, right? So in this next slide, what I highlighted in yellow are particularly very un-Buddhist. And then I realized that these particular 7 talismans, these yellow ones, I hope you see this well behind these buttons, but these 7 ones actually come from another set of talismans, which is this one. This particular example is from, I believe, Harvard Yenching Library in the Edo period, Japan. But both in China, Korea, and all among Korea, China, and Japan, this talisman seems to be very, very popular, but especially in Japan. So this is sort of the entire shot, but this is sort of close-up shot. If you see it, everyone has sort of same sort of visual representations. This is one talisman, and what you see is you can easily divide into 2 parts. One here, upper part, has lots of lines and, you know, small circles connected on all different shapes. And in total, we have 72 talismans together. Very interesting. And now that 7 that I just mentioned within our 24, this one now you see a little better visual here. So it's called hitting a jackpot, or in Korean, 금은 차례 당부. I translate in this way, so it's a little bit more fun. And you know, to remember next time when you go to Las Vegas, you know what talisman that you want to bring with. So look at this. This is very unique. So all these things that I just mentioned, this is actually constellation. It's basically the movement of stars in the sky. So people in the ancient time period, they thought the events happening in the heaven or on the celestial realm is deeply connected to what's happening on the earth, and they predicted or they relied on a lot of earthly events by observing stars and movements of stars and malicious stars or all these baleful stars. All these things were very important for them. So along that line, this particular tradition sort of divides this 72, and this one is very interesting because this one is actually modified version of 7-star. Do you know the 7-star Ursa Major near the north? Often up there, so it's kind of the very center of the, the celestial movements. And this is modified version to highlight the 6th. So there are 7 stars, but to highlight the 6th Uchu star. And this one is actually, each star has this corresponding elements according to Taoist or Chinese ideas of 5 agents. And this particular one in the middle is associated with metal, and metal means wealth. But also money. So it controls the wealth. So that's how people who devised or who saw this understood this is the, not just a random design, but actually has a lot of thoughts and ideas built in. I actually wrote about this 70 talismans more in this article. So if you are interested in to learn more about its Chinese beginning and Japanese adaptation later, please go ahead and look at this. But also, so that's kind of one piece of information that we want to keep in mind here. So there is this, to understand 24, one part is drawn from this 72 existing talismans. It's actually included in the Taoist canon, so you can sufficiently say that it's coming from Taoist influences. But another important area that we can keep in mind to understand Korean practice of talismans are dunhwang. Dunhwang is, here we go. So dunhwang is an oasis, currently part of China. And at the turn of 20th century, 1900 actually, 1900, this person, Mr. Wang, he was, living around the one area by himself happily, but accidentally he discovered an entrance of this massive, massive cave. Later, people call it a library cave because it holds so much new information. Because this particular cave, on this right-hand side image, sinologist Paul Palliot is actually a French scholar. He just discovered this massive new documents that has been sealed for close to 900, almost 1,000 years. So after the discovery of these dunhwang documents, whole story of Buddhism, because most of the documents that we found from dunhwang is Buddhist texts or images. So that really totally allowed scholars to rewrite the history of Buddhism and all these things. And also, for our interest, talisman is very importantly featured in that dunhwang element collections. So here we have, you just saw one popping up here, P, and there is a little dot. So P here means actually to honor this guy, Palliot. So the P comes from his last name, and there's a numbering system to identify each document. And this particular talisman is coming from that particular text, P3874. So there are 3. I'm not saying this is coming from dunhwang, but I'm saying the most ancient, most historically oldest encounter is this. So, and this one is very interesting. It kind of name varies, but at a certain point, it was, I think in Korean period, it was perceived, this talisman was understood as a talisman that make other people to fall in love with you. So now there we go. There's another talisman that you want to make a screenshot, maybe. Let me move on to the ritual use. So talismans were often used for actual rituals, right? And in Buddhist contexts, we have 3 major places to find talismans. One place is stupa. Stupa is monument or structure that holds the ashes of the Shakyamuni Buddha. Started that way, but then later on, Buddhist monastics did that. They wanted to be also cremated and then put their ashes in. But then already in the Tang period in China, even lay people, they wanted to sort of do the same. So stupa is one thing. And then funeral rituals. We already saw some coffins stamped, right? And then we have also pokjang or instrument objects that we already saw a little bit of each. So this particular stupa is also important for us to understand the 24 talismans, because this one on the left-hand side, inside, we find this is actually the modern sort of recopy of that particular text called the Diamond Sutra. And this person, Kang Gang, he basically he was a donor or sponsored the project. And at the end of that Diamond Sutra, we have these 10 talismans. And this is the earliest, as far as I know, that I made the outline with the sort of orange peach color. And look at this peach color. This is all matching from the earliest, which is 14th century Diamond Sutra. We can find that continued all the way till the when 24 became a set. And we also have another sort of example here of 24, and this is a little bit late Chosŏn period. And what you see here is maybe 3 structures, upper, middle, and lower. And we have some diagrams, various diagrams. And then we have in the middle, we have 24 talismans. And then probably the last one, the lower part, we have the donors' names written. And with this, we see the handles, right? With this, basically, you can use as a sort of stamping, basically mass-produce talismans. So imagine you have that. You can stamping on pretty much any, even surface to sort of bring the benefits that you wanted to, right? So what you see here in this screen is 18 talismans, and this is front and back clothes, shroud, which means cloth that actually no, this is actually somebody's clothes. This was found in the tomb of Chong-on, another early period Chosŏn Confucian scholar. When he died, his wife, this wife's clothes, she somehow managed to stamp these talismans that you see here, and then she put it in her husband's coffin. And in the coffin inside, also it was highly sort of decorated with talisman, same, wood blocks. And we see the interior of the coffin, we have some talismans and also this diagram here too. Oh, no. So here is mummy. Sorry. Well, you wouldn't see what it is if I didn't tell you what it is, right? So we have 12 talismans here, and this is actually 12 and the same talisman repeated. So people kept using this, and this one, so I'm giving you selective examples, right? There are a lot of clothes, but there are a lot of shrouds, and also this particular one is used as fillers, not to, when you put body in the coffin, you don't want that, that person moving within it. So we need fillers, and this one is used for that. But even those, we have a lot of people wanting to die with the Buddha. That's my point. Another area that talisman played a significant role in Buddhist context is the pokjang ritual that I mentioned. And here is one. Often in the statues of Amitabha Buddha, the one who guaranteed a better rebirth in the Pure Land, Amitabha are one of the popular ones that you find Buddhist talismans, because people really kind of it's telling people wanted to reborn in the better place, forget about these lives and, better life in the future, in the next lives. So what unites this, stupa, the three major places, stupa, coffin, and bokjang? They are all different. For instance, why people do bokjang ritual? Because the idea is to animate, to enliven, to make alive the dead pieces of, wooden structures or objects. That's kind of bokjang, basically the opposite of death. But stupa is also very ambiguous. Think about, when I mentioned stupa, it actually started with the mortuary ground of the Shakyamuni Buddha, but actually later on it became sort of reminder of the Buddha. The physical presence is actually testified by the structure. And coffin too, in Buddhism, death is not really death. It's a kind of limbo, it's liminal state that you have to come back again as another being. So my point is, in case there were hidden talismans included in the enclosed structure, all of these are closed structure, right? Were one of the most effective ways to increase its inaccessibility. This inaccessibility and the liminality ironically created a cosmic sort of space for talismans to remain activated and augmented. So, as I said, similar to the use of stupa, the common use of talisman in the stupa, coffins, and statues suggests that the essential function of talisman was to sacralize and shield the mortuary container. So, let me move on to the last part of rethinking Chosŏn Buddhism. Now, I'd like to sort of put it all together, or step back a little bit and think about what all these things means. To get to that, we also need to look at this one last 24 talismans. Actually, this is 24 from here to here, and then we have this one more auspicious sort of emblem. This is wooden block, and then the right one is the printed version of it. What is interesting about this particular one is, in Korean, it says 불설 8만 대장경 목록, which is the catalog of the 80,000 Buddhist canon taught by the Buddha. First of all, there are a lot of sort of lies here. First of all, it says this is what Buddha said, Buddha taught, but Buddha never taught. So that's first lie. Second lie is, it says the catalog of 80,000 Buddhist canon, but it sort of lists Buddhist canons that was composed, okay, let me give you a little bit historical background. In the 11th century, in Koryō period, Korean Buddhists, following the Chinese examples, they wanted to preserve the teachings of the Buddha in their own version. So we call it Buddhist canon. We call it Chosōn canon, or first Buddhist canon. We don't know how many wood blocks like this, but let's say over 80,000 of them. A lot of them were carved, and it got burned down. So about 150 years later, 13th century, we have another second set of this canon was created to replace what they lost then. So think about this connection. So this is basically claiming, this particular wood block is claiming that this is the catalog of that Buddhist canon, the 80,000 wood blocks, but actually it is not. So what's happening here is that by this point, Buddhists were very interested in all these talisman Buddhists. In other words, they wanted to make talismans Buddhists, more authentic Buddhists. And so, here. So we have the image of currently that 80,000 roughly. We do not know. It's depending on scholars, the counting differs, but roughly 80,000 wood blocks are stored. It looks like this currently at Haeinsa Temple in South Korea. So looking at this, what we can know also one lesser known aspects of Chosŏn Buddhism is that often people think, oh, hey, like Heiunsa, it was just simply Buddhist temples were a library, repository of those gyrographs. But another thing we also need to be remembered is based on, field works by some other scholars done in the 80s and 90s, actually there are a lot of woodblocks left all over in Buddhist temples, all over really. And many of them are Buddhist texts, sutras, like, Flower Garland Sutra or Lotus Sutra, whatever sutras, but actually a large number of them are also talismans. So another main takeaway that I like to share is Buddhist temples were still in Joseon period were major producer of Buddhist talismans and other printing. They were the preservers of the printing technology. They were basically running a printing workshop. Now, we have seen these two images before, right? The inside of coffins, both. And I briefly mentioned that there might have been a ready-made talisman shops in Joseon. So this is sort of very new to me too, but according to my research, there was a place called Koryō, Office of if you translate it, Office of Returning Generosity. I know it doesn't mean much to you, but basically what this institution, official institution, which we can verify from this official Korean chronicle, is that there was a coffin shop in Hanyang, which is the capital of Joseon, in the 15th century. Very interesting. And another interesting aspect is that, so at the coffin shop, actually currently located in Yongsan, where the President Yoon lives. There was a river there, so it really accessible to get the materials and also ship the heavy coffins once it was made. And Buddhist monastics were hired at that government institution. And my theory is not confirmed yet, but my theory is that probably if you saw these talismans, those institutions, this was not only one, there were actually other local Koryō too. So very likely these were also, unlike the common understanding of Confucian follows Confucian rituals, but there were also a lot of this mesh between this Confucian ritual, which is burial, but also using Buddhists technology or religiosity to protect those deceased person. Another, I know I'm running a little bit behind, but I have a couple more slides before I conclude, because I'm interested in also the lay people's lives, right? As I said, how talisman was, now we now know how it is made or distributed, but another aspect is, in theory, the Joseon law prohibited Joseon women from entering Buddhist temples. If you did that, you get 100 flogging, hitting. But in the Joseon's official records, there are so many lines: stop doing this, do not go to the temples, women, stop. So we know that in practice, that was not really well kept. But since it was officially prohibited, Buddhist monks or nuns were more proactive to basically use talismans as a way to connect their local followers. So on the left hand, this is very famous late Joseon period painter Kim Hong-do. He is known for his genre painting. Here we have these two Buddhist monks, or one could definitely, this is a monk, and they are selling something. Little bit not clear, but this is not, I don't think this, I first thought it was talisman, but actually this is another one called 모양문 or 권선문, little colorful strips that basically encouraging people to make a donation to these monastics, so that after they collect money and then Buddhist monastics, they can use it to sort of erect new buildings and do some Buddhist activities there. So this is not, but this, I want to give you some idea how that might have worked too. So here is not monks. This on the right-hand side, we have another very famous genre painting, Shingyunbok. Both are known for very satirical, very realistic representation of the lay people's lives in late Joseon. But here, what you see is not Buddhist monks, but they are actually lay people, although this person has little similar shaped hat here, signifying that this person, they have some association with, also instruments associated with Buddhism. And they are basically attracting these passengers, passerby, passing people. And this woman, similar to this, she is going to pay. But this person, I think, is very likely, or, you can use our imaginations. Talisman may have used this way, may have sold in this way. And more about this people, lay people who are performing. And these are actually very interesting group called Sadangpe. And we have very little information about it, but some visual information, such as this one, this is part of the Gamnodo, or painting of nectar, has some, clues. They are actually, this is Buddhist painting, and on the margin, we see this itinerant performers, the lowest in the Joseon society, but they were actually had some loose tie with Buddhist monastics or Buddhist temples. They even lived nearby, and they were the one actually actively were selling talismans, and some part of the commission are going to the Buddhist temples. And this is 1920 and 1938, right? The photography of one of the last generations of Sadangpe. Basically, they are the entertainers. They are probably the first K-pop, the original K-pop people, but they were, I can tell you more later, but anyway, Sadangpe was, stigmatized and eventually wiped out, and they are not extant, except there is, after that, there is Nam Sadangpe, and then, anyway, to make it simpler, so Sadangpe was very important social group who were selling these talismans. Now, conclusion. Thank you for your patience. So you didn't know, but I was doing a puzzle with you guys. So, but I didn't tell you where, so we start with this 7 one, right? Remember the yellow ones, and then we talked about this peach color one, and then the, also the Dunang one, and the green ones that I didn't talk about. The only example that I could find in Korean, context was the Bumso Chongjiji, which is Korea period sort of Dharani texts manual, and that is sort of, you can match the rest of it. So combined together, the 24 talismans functioned as a giant talisman, but also this particular 24 example, people could, this is not actually used, right? People used it as a reference. So, 14, 18, or 24, or total, whichever number, it was very fluid. And but once it was used as a 24, as you saw in funerary context, this complex vision creates uncanny effects or emotions for their viewers, and also its fluid formats allow the other hearers to interact with individual or multiple talismans for different purposes. And the 24 talismans occupy the central place in Chosån Buddhist devotional practice. And the multiple layers of ambiguities built around the talismans, such as tensions between text and image. As I said, it's kind of at the boundary between image and text. It's legible, some parts you can read, but a lot of parts is not legible. It's illegible. but that's intentional. Also, yeah, so legibility and illegibility, as well as accessibility and inaccessibility, as I said, where it is stored, how talismans spatially constructed. All of these ambiguities played a key role in enacting the efficacy and potency of talismans. Ultimately, my examples challenge the common view of Chosŏn Buddhism being dormant and defeated. Rather, I hope that these talks and all my examples present surprisingly vibrant and dynamic picture of Chosŏn Buddhism. Thank you so much for your attention. And here's my email. I look forward to our Q&A. But if I didn't answer all your questions, please feel free to write to me, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sujung. What a fascinating talk you have just given. Nobody has left. You kept the audience wrapped. So here is,
All right.
right, you can read the message, but let me try to read this, so then my speed will be slower than you read with your eyes. So thank you for this fascinating talk. I have a question about the authorship of these talismans. Were people allowed to copy the talisman for themselves and their families, or only monks could make them and sell to people? Did the authorship affect the efficacy of the talisman? Oh, man, talisman. Okay. Here's the
Thank
question.
you. Thank you, Gillian, for relating the question. And thank you. I think this person's Aria. And thank you so much. This is excellent question, the authorship question. So were people allowed to copy the talismans for themselves? So it seems, because, already in the Dunhuang manuscripts, we have evidence that a lot of